Hello everyone and welcome to the first in our series of Digital Preservation Awards winners webinars. My name is Sarah Middleton. I'm the Head of Advocacy and Community Engagement for the DPC. I'm joined today by some of my colleagues, William Kilbride, Paul Wheatley, Jen Mitchum, and I'm very excited to introduce you to two of our Digital Preservation Awards winners today as well, and a guest of honour, but I'll do that in just a minute. Before we do get going properly, just one or two items of housekeeping to keep everything running smoothly. So you'll have heard me say to Paul that we're recording, so the webinar will be recorded and made available at the end of the week on YouTube and the DPC website. So if you prefer not to appear in that, just keep your camera off. If you could also keep your microphones muted unless you're speaking, that keeps all the background noise down as well. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your video off as well unless you're speaking. We do have a discussion session planned for the second half of the webinar, so at least if you keep it off till then and then on again when you chat, that's fine. Because we do want you to all get involved in the discussion, and there are various ways you can do that. So if you'd like to contribute, please do just speak up if there's a pause in conversation, or use the raise hand function if someone else is speaking. If you've got questions or comments that come up while another colleague is talking, please do pop them in the chat box. Paul's going to be watching out for those and can feed those into the discussion for us. When you're using the chat box, if you could just make sure you address your questions to everyone so Paul can see them and feed them in, that would be great. And there's also a range of non-verbal reactions you can use, so thumbs ups and things like that. And if we don't manage to get to your question during the session, we'll make sure, I'm sure those speakers won't mind if we pass those on to you after the webinar so you can respond that way as well. So that's the housekeeping done. I'm going to just hand over to William first, William without his camera, to say a few words about why we're here, what are we here for, to talk to us a bit about the Digital Preservation Awards. William, are you there?
Of course, yes, I'm here, and I've got my video to work. I've got my video to work. There you are. What could be nicer, just for Bradley's benefit? I'm going to wave directly to the camera, but you'll see me in profile, which is always the most handsome view. So what are we here for? So firstly, a warm welcome. This is it's great to have you all here, and it's great to be celebrating the work of digital preservation in this sort of crazy year of 2020. So the DPC runs the Digital Preservation Awards. We've been doing it since 2004, and we do it as a way every 2 years of marking outstanding work in the digital preservation community. Let's not kid ourselves, the digital preservation community can sometimes be work that's unrewarded. It doesn't have the spotlight, doesn't get the spotlight, so it gives us an opportunity every 2 years to bring that spotlight on your work, and to celebrate the generous and clever and creative solutions which collectively come together to make it possible for us to ensure a secure digital legacy. So 2020, an awards year every second year, and we start the planning for this quite long in advance. And in this case, we started planning just about probably November last year. We started the process of planning for the Digital Preservation Awards. But it wasn't quite the year we had in mind, was it, Sarah? We had grand plans. We were planning to hold the grand finale, the ceremony where we present the awards. We had a great time in Amsterdam in 2018. We were going to have a grand ceremony at the newly opened Bibliothèque Nationale de Luxembourg. But as the year's events unfolded, it became obvious we had to do something radically different. Now, what to do? Actually, radically different included briefly considering not running it at all, because we had so many other things to deal with and so many other challenges to face. But then we thought to ourselves, this year, of all years, we've got a huge amount to celebrate. We've never had quite as much to celebrate, nor have we ever needed quite as much to celebrate. And that's really the story now of the Digital Preservation Awards. We presented the awards formally, put out the call for invitations or call for nominations. We got an overwhelming response to the call for nominations, as we often do. and we presented 6 categories. We presented an award for collaboration and cooperation, and an award for research and innovation. And we're going to hear from Bradley and also Shira and Brian in relation to both of those in a moment. We also have an award for teaching and communications, won by the Digital Records Curation Programme at the City University of New York and International Council on Archives. The Student Award, always a popular category, this year won by Lotte Wiseman at Amsterdam University. We had the award for the most distinguished or outstanding digital preservation initiative in commerce industry in the third sector. That's the prize for everyone who's not an archivist or a librarian or a research data manager, as it were, which was won by the UN High Commission for Refugees. An award for safeguarding the digital legacy for just getting on and doing digital preservation. That was won by the UK Web Archive. And today, also we're joined as our guest of honour in today's proceedings by Mickey Lindlar, who is 2020 DPC Fellow. I'm not going to talk much about these award-winning initiatives or the work because the speakers will do that for us. One observation though from me as I draw this sort of series introduction to a close is to observe that I think every year we have this, or every time we run the awards, we have this big focus on the ceremony, and the big focus on the ceremony makes it a really lovely thing to participate in. But we have sometimes reflected that the focus on the ceremony takes away from the story of the good practice and the sharing of all that great expertise and knowledge, which is present very much in the awards. So if we've lost the ceremony this year, and if we've lost that little bit of kind of magic and pizzazz, well, maybe we can focus on that really good practice and really focus on the great story of the creativity and the generosity which has moved us forward in the context of digital preservation once again. So that was what I wanted to say by way of introduction to the series. Sarah, do you want to now introduce really what's going to happen in the next 45 minutes or so?
Yeah, and just to note that another reason we're not going to we're not going to go back and look at the work of our winners again is because there's actually, each one has a page on the Digital Preservation Coalition website for the awards section, and they've also contributed to short videos where you can find out and you can hear them speaking all about their work. So we're not going to ask them to say the same things again. Instead, this series of webinars is going to look to the future. So we asked our speakers for their reflections on 2020, of course, but also their plans for 2021 and what they would like to see for the future kind of more broadly, their hopes and their dreams for their work and for digital preservation. So each day, today, tomorrow and Thursday, we're going to hear from 2 of our winners in turn. They're going to speak for 15 minutes each, and we're going to have a good chat with them afterwards, so with your questions too. So let me introduce our speakers for today, because today we have for speaking on behalf of the NDSA and the Levels of Digital Preservation Revision Project, we have Bradley Daigle, and we have speaking on behalf of the Levels of Born Digital Access, we have Brian Dietz and Shira Peltzman. We're also delighted to be joined by our guest of honour, as William said, the DPC Fellowship recipient, Mickey Lindlar, who is going to be joining us for the discussion later on. But first up, let me introduce Bradley Daigle for the NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation Revision Project. And the updated levels represent a codification of current technological practices for long-term preservation of digital resources in galleries, libraries, archives and museums. The guidelines are presented in an easy to understand matrix designed to be useful for newcomers and experts alike. And the redesign project looked at 5 functional areas of digital preservation and recommended a tiered set of practices that map to 4 increasingly robust levels of digital preservation. The levels are now available in multiple languages, and the update also includes an assessment tool and technological implementation guidance for using the levels. So Bradley, we asked you to reflect on your lessons learned from this strange year and to talk a little about the plans for the levels and aspirations for the future. So would you like to take it away?
Certainly. Thank you, Sarah. And welcome, everyone. Happy to talk about any of this, both on and offline, if questions arise. And as Sarah mentioned, the levels are getting a very good broad view in terms of translations as well, which is great. We now have them in Portuguese, Turkish, Spanish, and I do seem to recall, which I hope was an alcohol-infused promise, but from someone on this call for a German version. So they might also be an awardee of the DPC. Oh, Mickey, thank you for self-identifying. So looking forward to the German version as well. So that'll be awesome. But of course, awards and nominations do take precedent, I understand. So talking a bit about the levels and where things are going, many of you have heard about the broader plan. You've heard me speak about the broader plan, about the overarching vision for the levels. We are, I would say, at this point, maybe midstream in the levels work overall, which is going to be a tricky part for us because not only are we starting to enter a new phase for the levels management, we're also strongly iterating the current levels that have just been revised. So we are doing I think a very complicated dance with a version of the levels that's been revised, a revision of that revised levels, and then also rolling out new components of the levels and identifying new views onto the levels themselves. So that's, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The other piece, which I think to Sarah's question, and I think is for me the most surprising element of the broader levels conversation, is something that we think about, we do in some ways and to varying degrees with digital preservation work, but not always does it get a light shone upon it in the way that it has now, which is the way that this work is actually managed and rolled out. And I think that's what I've been hearing increasingly about the levels, which is people's curiosity and desire to understand and emulate the actual nature of how the levels work was undertaken and executed successfully. I don't want to talk about this in a way that makes it seem like oddly self-serving because I was the one who led the effort. So I want to dance around that and speak really more to how the different groups interrelated and the different roles that individuals can play. So the governance component and the actual management of the moving parts took on almost as large a component of 2020 as the levels themselves, which was probably the biggest takeaway surprise for me going forward, because when you're in the middle of it, it's just, stuff's flying all around. As the DPC folk know, it's, you're just reacting, flying your digital preservation starship and hoping that, you can just not fly into a sun. So I think that, as my good colleague always reminds me, any landing you can walk away from is a good one. So I think digital preservation has that as well. So the next steps for the levels in particular, we currently, as we speak, are finishing the final touches on the curatorial piece. And that is basically, for those of you who don't know, it's an initial conversation to have with anyone who's bringing in collections and hopes to manage collections. And it provides the means by which they can start thinking about the digital preservation practical considerations of collections management in addition to just the collection itself. So in other words, it's meant to foster conversations between and among a very heterogeneous body of individuals that most organizations represent. So it's not predicated on a knowledge of digital preservation, it's predicated on a conversation that helps elicit those digital preservation kind of black holes that we often wind up falling into, such as promises made to donors about making materials accessible in perpetuity. Things like that that seem simple and very easy to say. However, the infrastructure and the resource implications of that are staggering. So having those conversations up front and understanding the implications of collections management as part of a digital preservation component. And in fact, kind of foregrounding digital preservation concerns in the collections management and intake process is the goal for that. So that is going to be published probably in the next week or two, certainly by the end of the calendar year. So look to that. That's been out for public comment, but we hope more people start using it and iterating on it as well. So that's the first part. The second part is our teaching, outreach, and advocacy group that has a couple DPC members on it. It has Sharon and Jen, as well as Nance McGovern. So we got a pretty powerful, supergroup rock trio from the 70s working on how to frame the levels of digital preservation in a way that allows people to understand, teach, and then think about what role they can play in an organization. So that work is finishing up its initial stages. And the idea behind that is that too has a target to be iterated, implemented. People can use the materials in workshops, in conversations. So they're really getting it to the first version of framing the conversation and framing the components of it. And after that, we hope that the broader community takes it and makes it its own and adapts it promiscuously so that it can just find its way into any organization that needs it and can be deployed in ways that make sense. So those are the two active pieces. The Levels itself has a steering group that is looking at providing a strategic roadmap for 2021, and that is the work we're doing now. So we're having conversations about whether or not we want to have an economic layer overview to the levels. How do you map the technological implementation to the economics of what that implementation requires? Staffing, whether you use third-party services, things like that, storage. So we're having conversations around that. There's been conversations around the risk view within the levels of digital preservation as well. So there's a few components that we're looking at kind of expanding into. And then, of course, creating the means by which all of these can be iterated more frequently than has been hitherto the case. So that's, I think, our goal for the short term here. And my hopes for 2021 and dreams is that we are able to find, continue to strike that good balance of kind of grassroots effort and kind of oversight and management to take advantage of all that good energy and good ideas. So that's kind of our next steps. The governance piece, I think, is also something, as I mentioned, that it requires more deeper reflection. In particular, what I've heard is that people want to see how they can use how we manage the levels and apply it to different solutions, different problem sets that they're discovering and that they're encountering. How are we able to take over 200 individual interests and distill it into working groups, keep those working groups on point, handling complex information, complex viewpoints, but yet still producing results that have a clear impact on the broader community. So that governance piece, I even need to reflect on a little bit more and kind of recast how we were able to use that so that it isn't just a one-off and that we could pair the levels of digital preservation with different kind of strategy models and governance structures that could help manage and hone such complex efforts. So those are kind of the, nothing small, of course. It should be easy. We'll just keep going. But that's kind of what's top of mind for me for leaving 2020 and going into 2021.
Great. As you say, small goals, perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Bradley. There's lots to look forward to in 2021. Does anybody have a question for Bradley immediately? I'm going to pause for a moment and just watch the chat box or watch for a question. Otherwise, we'll move on.
Well, actually, I'd like to ask a question. I couldn't raise my hand because I didn't find the raise hand function.
Oh, I see.
Hi, from Germany. As you mentioned, the German version, well, in fact, I am guilty of being a bit too early about translating it because, in fact, in 2000, I think in 2017, I saw the levels, Bradley, and I immediately thought it might be worthwhile to translate them, and they have, in fact, appeared in a German archivist journal. They're a bit buried among other pages, and I've sent the link on the chat to where to find it. Or now I'm going to send it. I have to press enter, and now it's out. You can see it. It is. Well, there might be a revision, I think. You've really made enormous progress, and in some way, I regret to have been too early on that.
No, you shouldn't be. There's plenty of people that are still have their strategies based on the initial version. So multiple versions will help everyone, without a doubt.
Okay, and we already use it in education, archival education. It's really helpful to kind of scan the whole sheet. You can print it on one page, and that's it's the best thing to do for training as well. Thank you very much for your effort.
Thank you.
Fabulous, and I can see that you have a Finnish translation in the pipeline as well.
I had heard that was coming. That's excellent.
Yeah, good stuff. Right, well, thank you very much. We're going to move on to hear from another set of levels. Oh yes, that's a good idea. Can we have a round of virtual applause, please, before we move on? Please use your non-verbal reactions. Yes, so we'll move on to another set of levels, the levels of born digital access, which provide a tiered set of format-agnostic practices to facilitate and improve access to born digital materials across 5 distinct areas: accessibility, description, researcher support and discovery, security and tools. In addition to defining a set of recommended baseline access requirements, the levels of born digital access also lay out concrete and actionable recommendations that institutions can implement according to their needs, resources and abilities. Developed using an iterative and collaborative approach, the levels document is responsive to practitioners' and researchers' needs, while also serving as a potentially inclusive model for future standards and development. So here to talk to us about all of that today, or the future of the levels of born digital access today, are Brian Dietz and Shira Peltzman. So I'm going to hand over to you guys as well. I don't know who would like to speak first, but we did ask you to reflect on what you've learned from 2020 and to talk about your plans for what's next.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start out and then pass the baton off to Brian. I just want to start out first and foremost by just saying thank you once again to the DPC and then also to the Software Sustainability Institute for running these awards and just supporting the cause in general. I think it's a really great opportunity, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about what this opportunity has meant for the levels and for us. So just first and foremost, thank you. As far as reflections on 2020, what a weird year it's been. You know, these levels were published right at the beginning of February, about a month before, almost exactly a month before we went into lockdown. That is obviously strange, not such fortuitous timing for a resource that is really primarily like oriented toward providing on-site access to materials. So that was, it was funny. We were so excited to put these out into the world, and then so quickly they became something that were, you know, just sort of like unrealizable, at least in the interim. But that said, you know, we are sort of thinking ahead. I mean, I know it's different everywhere internationally, of course, and then even within the United States, it's very different. For example, I have been working from home since March 13th, and no plans to go back to working on site anytime soon. We're all prevented from going in and being on site, but that isn't the case for institutions elsewhere in the US. So I think gradually, as some institutions start returning to work, we are hoping that we will see a kind of like uptick in like a renewed interest in what this document has to offer. But even though research services did kind of go out the door and are not yet totally back to normal, far from back to normal, depending on where you are, one thing that's really kind of forced us to think about is the focus or the lack thereof in this current version on online access. We did primarily focus, as I mentioned, on-site access to materials. That isn't to say that we don't mention online access a few times in the document. We do, but certainly the document is not kind of geared toward providing recommendations for online access. And I think that's definitely something that we are realizing we need to kind of like extend a focus on. And I know for myself, and I know for other people, that's something that all of a sudden, you know, our administrations are highly invested in, and that's great. I think there's a real opportunity there, and so I see a lot of potential in that vein. And I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Brian, but I think either way, I'll hand it over to you to talk about 2021.
Yeah, thanks, Shara. And I may be briefly accompanied by a double bass in the background, so I apologize for that. Sound carries when you're playing the double bass. So I think sort of following on what Shira just said, and sort of like plans for 2021, but also dreams for 2021, I think that the levels of Born Digital Access, you know, we wrote them as practitioners for practitioners, and you know, drew on the knowledge that we had from, you know, providing access to Born Digital materials, what we had been doing, what we wanted to be doing. And I think this is sort of what Shira is talking about a little bit, is hoping that the state of access to Born Digital will progress over the year and beyond, so that you know, we may be able to expand the scope and the usefulness and some of the resources that are referenced in the document. So for instance, this year, I hope to be able to explore some of the virtual computing resources at my university. And, you know, the nice thing about loading files into a virtual desktop is that if you require that files be accessed on site, you can do that on site. But if files can be accessed remotely, they could also be accessed remotely through a virtual machine. I mean, the other sort of dream, you know, that this is sort of a joke, is that, you know, I hope that in a year we are talking about whether and how the levels have been translated into German or Finnish or what have you. But really, you know, what I hope is that the levels are as sort of successful, as well received as they are at the end of next year as they are at the end of this year. And it really has been gratifying to go through this process and to see that support, because, you know, when we were starting out, you know, this is sort of a funny thing to admit in this context, we didn't exactly punt on our sustainability plan, but we also didn't want to invest a whole lot of time in our sustainability plan because we didn't know that we had a resource that the community would find useful that even needed to be sustainable. So we didn't want to front load all of that effort into a plan that may not ever get, you know, put into place. We do have the structure of the Digital Library Federation and its Born Digital Access Working Group. I think within that context, what we need to do is sort of start an official like maintainers group in that in that organization. And, you know, like starting off, that can be small things like, we know that we have a broken link to EXIF tool, we need to fix that. We can do a better job at tracking stats on a regular basis, tracking and compiling stats in our OSF. And then, you know, just sort of keeping our eyes out for feedback, and also analyzing our document against some of the other outputs that our Born Digital Access Working Group teams are putting out. There are several other teams that are working on, you know, their various projects that intersect with our document in, you know, one way or another. And as Shira said, as you either as we sort of expand our sort of mechanisms for providing access to these sorts of materials, or we start to return to on-site. And also, I think following some of the, some of the boost in PR that I think we probably received from this award, as well as the NDSA Innovation Award. I think that we hope that we'll start to see some new or renewed interest and engagement and opportunities for promotion, and to see how people are interacting with this document, how they may be using this document on site. Very similar to, I think, what the levels of preservation have done in the past, promoting it as an advocacy tool, trying to see how people are actually using it. And then, I think that there are some other things that we could potentially do that maybe we can get into in the Q&A. Shira, did you want to say anything else about how the award helps us achieve our potential goals?
I think really like echoing what you said, it's just, we noticed right away a kind of uptick in hits to our OSF repository after we did that lightning talk at IPRES, and kind of with each public presentation where we've gotten a chance to really talk about it. And yeah, I mean, I think just like really, because there was this period of time where actually utilizing this document was so difficult, if not impossible, I think really kind of trying to just keep its profile elevated so that, people remain aware of it, and, start to, keep it at top of mind when they return to work. And I do think access is going to be one of the major kind of areas of focus over the next several years going forward. So just kind of, yeah, like I think it's been a really amazing opportunity to have all of the kind of like awareness raising that this award has enabled us to do. Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, thank you both. That's great. Well, you've got a good audience here of multilingual language speakers. If you were looking for volunteers, it looks like you've come to the right place. So perhaps that is something we can be talking about next year. That would be great to see. I'm going to pause for a moment as well again, and ask for another virtual round of applause, if I may, for you both. Thank you very much. Before we move on to our discussion portion of the webinar. So while people are thinking, perhaps digesting, composing and compiling their questions for you, let me introduce Mickey Lindlar, who is our DPC Fellowship Awardee recipient. Mickey, would you like to say a few words about your experience with the awards process, and also what you've heard from our speakers today?
Sure. Thanks for the invitation, first off, and the kind introduction. So I'd like to briefly reflect on what has been said today. Very nice round to be in, and actually something that I think we think that standards might be easier to maintain than code, but it's actually the other way around, I find. I think code and software is much easier to maintain, and also to check whether it's still current. We can compile code, we can check if it still runs, but we can't do the same thing for de facto standards or frameworks that we use. So I think the levels are two great examples, things that are current today, but that we need to look in an active manner in the future too, to be able to use them over the course of time. And we've heard some great ways of how we can do that, but something that could be made stronger as a point is a call to everyone in the audience to actually go and use the standards, and then to come back and talk about it, to report on it. Something we've had a great success in the premise community, for example, is implementation fairs. And I'd love to see implementation fairs for frameworks like the levels of preservation and the levels of born digital access, to see how different institutions and different people put them to use, and to discuss what works and what didn't work. And for my personal hopes for the future, I mentioned some of them in the talk that I gave in my acceptance speech, and I think some of them actually map to the two different levels that were presented here too. You guys share more than just the levels in your name. I think something that you have in common is you come from a very strong North American background. Both of you do. You come from a GLAM background, deeply rooted in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. You are more of a conceptual framework to some way codified, but more so than something that can be leveraged automatically in processes. And also, of course, given the nature of the webinar we're in today, you have a strong preservation background. And I'm wondering if we look into the future, and this is actually a question that I have for both of the awardees here, is how do you plan to move forward from that? Both of you mentioned that to some degree. You mentioned that you want to move from the national to the international side through translations. And I'm wondering, for the levels of access, how you can actually learn from the levels of preservation, how you can share your success there with other frameworks, but also how do you plan to move from the GLAM area into maybe more of the research data management area or into the industry sector? And is there any thought given from moving from the preservation sector actually into the access sector or more the data producer sector to see if we can push the boundaries there? And then lastly, understandability is not just about translation, but it's also about the language that we speak and the understandability of the terminology itself. And another question that I have is, do you consider both frameworks to be suitable for management staff, technology staff, and preservationist, curationist staff alike? And if not, is there room to make it more understandable through the different views, for example, that Bradley mentioned, to wider audiences?
That's a lot of questions.
That's a lot of questions. Sorry.
Who wants to have a go first?
Well, I can start a little bit and speak a little bit to what the levels has been thinking about and my own thinking on that. I will not get every part of the multi-part question density that you've achieved, Mickey, but I'll hit some of it. And I do agree that the ongoing challenge to make these to make the levels itself a useful tool is to continuously iterate and find a way to establish that dialogue, as I mentioned, between grassroots practitioners as well as the multi-tiers within an organization. And certainly the curatorial piece that I spoke to has greatly benefited by the presence of both David Underdown from the UK National Archives and Angela Beeking from Libraries Archives Canada, so that we didn't just go down the higher ed academic library route for solutions that have their own set of blind spots. So that was an example of helping expand that vision. Now that's just one large example. I love the idea of the implementation fair, as you mentioned, and I think that would be a great next step. As far as, so I forgot everything in between. I'll go to the last one, which is the levels themselves. The goal that I've always talked about with the levels as a package is that it is a flexible and modular set of interconnecting decision points, from taking in a collection, understanding how it maps to its technological implementation of preservation, and then thinking about how an assessment guides that practice, policies that you have or may not have that you need. But then also when you start thinking about the economic components and the other constituent elements that we're developing, the idea is that it really becomes a very powerful advocacy component. And this is what I've been pushing people to think about, which is, if you think about a collection, you think about what your organization's mission and goals are, then you can follow the natural progression of deciding how that collection should be managed and preserved as a way to map to both your current state, a hope for future state. But the idea is that a single practitioner could work through a collection, decide how it could be preserved, and then assign a cost, whether that cost is in risk or it's in dollars or some kind of financial sense, and then reverse and say, do we have the funding for that? And if the answer is no, we don't have the means by which this collection can be preserved in the way the donor wants it preserved, then you have two choices. You don't take the collection, or you use that data to be a powerful advocate for the finances needed for that collection. So then it does become an advocacy tool that does work with management, who hopefully would be able to see the data and the ideas behind it. So for me, I think it has a twofold point, which can work at any level within an organization, whether it's only aspirational or it's just purely practical. That's a good starting point, I think. And the more people using it, the more refined that would be.
Super. Shira, Brian, would you like to add anything to that?
I was looking to see if Shira was going to unmute first.
Who's going to go first?
Those are all really great questions and a lot to think about. And I also have lost track of a few of them probably, but the one that jumped out at me was the question about who the audience is for, whether it's, you know, technologists, preservationists, archivists, management. I tend to think of these as sort of written with archival practitioners in mind. And, you know, so I used to be sort of like the digitization person at my institution. And, you know, there were some, because of that, because I was the digital person in the archives, you know, there were always discussions about like, well, you know, what should we do with Born Digital? What should we do with Born Digital? And I'm talking about like really processing, like arrangement and description. And when I started out thinking about those things, I always thought of them as technological problems. But then really, I don't think that I made any sort of, or our department really didn't make any sort of, we didn't make any sort of gains until we started thinking of it as like an archival problem, meaning like we had the expertise. We already knew what we wanted to do with these objects as archival objects. And that allowed us to sort of translate our needs to the technologists who were going to develop tools to help us support these things. And I think that that's how I also think of the recommendations in the levels of Born Digital Access, is that, you know, it's for practitioners and maybe their managers, and then managers to talk with other managers and talk to technologists. I mean, I know from, you know, sort of one of the nice things about my job is that I get to work with technologists to build like fun applications to support, you know, digital special collections. And, you know, they all want really sort of specific problems that are going to be solved. And then, you know, of course, they always come up with some really interesting creative solutions to solving those problems, but they need us to tell us what our problems are. And I think that's what the levels sort of help people think through.
Yeah, and I would also, just as far as the question about how are we going to reach out to new areas or different, you know, things like data and things like that. I think one of the key things for us was that we wanted to design these levels so that we kind of understood them as being like forkable in a sense. Like we were hoping really that we could create something that was both, you know, applicable to a number of contexts, but also recognizing that like there's just no one size fits all. As much as inclusive as you want to be, and as much as you try to really, you know, make these something that are universal, like that is ultimately never going to work in every case. And so we really wanted to try and create something and specifically encourage people to basically like take these levels and adapt them for their own use case. Like if you're not in the GLAM sector, if you are in, you know, another field, research data, for example, like by all means, take these, adapt them, and then tell us what you've done so that we can, you know, make those changes and incorporate those if there are things to be incorporated. That was kind of firmly our idea. And yeah, we really hope to see more of that. We haven't seen any yet, but I also think that's a product of just the current state of the world. So so yeah, that's the logic there.
Excellent, thanks everyone. I know you've sort of responded to this in the chat box, Bradley, but Helen Zafta asked a good question about factoring in plans to factor in the environmental considerations. So how servers are powered, environmental impact into the levels, and do you think that is something that could form part of your plans for 2021?
If there's sufficient interest and if people want to take the lead with it, absolutely. I think it's a great example, Helen, in this regard of how the levels can reflect people's motivators and how you have a core principle, a core set of activities that can then be viewed from different points in its kind of prismatic approach to digital preservation. So if one of your drivers is environmental sustainability, then how can you use the levels to express and highlight that that component? And one of the main outcomes I'm really hoping for in terms of the levels of digital preservation from soup to nuts is that it drives a multi-sector or a pan-sector approach to greater transparency. So, where we talk about elements of fixity, where we talk about elements of, how digital preservation is done, we need to figure out what the right balance is between kind of open transparency and what I would call, and others like David Rosenthal have talked about it, and assurance. So how can we get assurance that what our core principles need, how they need to be met, is happening without having to sign a non-disclosure agreement, without having to know exactly how the preservation is happening? What are the means by which we as a community can help third-party, for-profit individuals and companies provide that assurance so that we can tie something like environmental impact of a storage solution to those costs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the whole piece that I think, as both Brian and Shira have talked about, and I think put in very, very good terms, is the more people help us think through these things and look at them differently, the more it should help the community.
And I also just want to jump in here and say, I think this is, I'm thinking on my feet, so I realize there's some sort of like problematic things with what I'm about to say as well, but I just want to point out that I think that similar to what I was talking about with it being impossible for there to be kind of something that one size fits all, something that works equally well for everybody in all contexts. I think that I see a lot of potential for something like the kind of like environmental levels that speak to like environmental sustainability, for example. While I don't think that there should necessarily be a distinct levels framework for every individual topic, the reason why the levels of access of Born Digital Access exists in the first place is because we saw a real gap in the levels of preservation, the first iteration of that. And we were aware that there was a plan when we started this work. It was back in 2017, and we knew that there was work underway to kind of address and revise the levels, but we also felt like this was something very specific and that we had real kind of momentum behind. And so we made a conscious decision to kind of like go our own route. And so, this is just to say that like, I don't know, or I just want to like raise the potential for other documents, other frameworks that do, use that kind of, that logic, that kind of tiered, a very clear format that the levels really pioneered, and to kind of take that idea and run with it. So just wanted to throw that out there as food for thought. But again, I understand that with other resources, other questions about sustainability and like a fragmentation of of all these resources, which is also potentially unhelpful in some other aspects. So.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Mickey, did that answer your questions?
Yes, I mean, there were a lot of questions, but
They
were meant to pick and choose from as you like. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thanks. Are there any other questions? William, I know you mentioned that you had one or two up your sleeve. Would anybody else like to chime in? Perhaps, William, you could ask yours while others are thinking.
Yeah, I mean, you all hear enough from me, so I'm quite happy to sit back. There's Nance. Take Nancy's questions first up, right? And I'll come on if I need to. Nancy, have you got your mic on? I should just invite you to. Yeah, Nancy, go for it.
No, it was just a follow-up to Shira's point that I was just clarifying that for me, it's not so much a gap, but a layer, and we need layers that complement each other and are sort of could be optional. It just depends. But anyway, I was suggesting that there could be a context in which a community discussion at some point to kind of look at how do the pieces that we've developed within the community fit together so that they don't inadvertently confuse people.
True, that's a good point.
I think in the first year of our work, because our work is really sort of like a 2-year, has been a 2-year effort. I think we had, Bradley, do you remember we had a meeting? I think it was Shira was probably there, Carol Cussman was there, you were there, maybe Paige Walker was there, and we talked about, it's so long ago, like there's at least been a discussion about what the relationship is between these two levels. And that's, I mean, I sort of think that, I mean, maybe Mickey, you didn't, maybe it wasn't an explicit question, but if I heard it in one of your questions that there is a conversation about how these two things relate. And I think that's maybe another meeting sometime in 2021, just what we need, more meetings. But it's a potential discussion to see. I think at that time, and Bradley or Shira, please weigh in and tell me if I'm wrong about this, that I think we decided that administratively it was probably just simpler for the DLF group to sort of take on this layer, as Nancy said. But it's, I think it's worth having a look to see what the complementary areas are.
And I think that's especially true for the levels of preservation to point towards other ones, like the preservation storage criteria will be really helpful to have a strong connection between those and the levels of preservation as well.
So maybe I could come back in then with the sort of thought that Mickey provokes from me, but sort of turn into a question for our speakers. So Mickey, you said something really clever that I want to just pause for a moment and take us back to. You said something about, we think it's hard to maintain technology, but actually it's harder to maintain community, and harder to maintain standards. And I think that's really, I applaud that. I think that's entirely right. And in some sense, I feel my career bundled up into that one little absolute kernel of insight that you brought to us there, Mickey. So let's think on that for a moment. One of the things as I look back at the awards, not just this year, but previous years, the number of times when it's simple community activities which have been brought to the table, which just raise a cheer from the judges of the Preservation Awards. I'm thinking off the top of my head, invidious to name them, but off the top of my head, I'm thinking about remember the Archivist's Guide to Cryoflux, which was just like a group getting together and writing something, and that won the training award a couple of years ago. I think of all these other initiatives where that's true. The thing, I guess, as I reflect on this, two things that take me to questions. And number one, Bradley and the NDSA levels. I mean, this is version 2. I mean, it's version 2. That is a success, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? The very fact that community has sustained and grown and continued that work, well done. So the question in that sense is, what happens to maintain, or what is the magic pixie dust that you scattered over this to maintain that community, which, as Mickey says, is I agree, is the hardest part in some sense of that maintenance. The second question comes maybe to Shira and Brian, thinking about access and community, and if you like, a different sense, community of users, right, and understanding user needs and user requirements. Do you know, it's a weird thing for me that digital preservation, where are all the great guidebooks about access? Where are all the great guidebooks about user feedback and usability? Where are all the great guidebooks about doing focus groups with your designated communities? You know, we're really, really poor on that. And so there's a question in my mind about the community of users, right? And how do we form and maintain a community of users, especially in such crazy times as 2020? Is there anything you would have understood differently about the user community in 2021 that, you know, doesn't apply anymore or is different? And how do we maintain a fix on that sense of community? But anyway, I'll pass that on to Bradley or to Shira or to Brian, or indeed anyone on the call who wants to chip in.
I unmuted, but it doesn't mean I need to speak.
I like, I really am drawn to the expression of like pixie dust. Like it seems like that it's because, you know, I mean, I've wondered about that with our group too. Like I think that, and this sort of goes back to some of the things we've been talking about previously. I think that you've got to have the right problem. You have to have the right scope. Sometimes it's just dumb luck that you get the right people together, but it's probably useful to have somebody who's passionate and maybe has a little bit of charisma, has a little bit of, you know, insight, and can bring people together and keep people excited. I mean, that was one of the things that was sort of amazing about the our levels group, is like very little waning enthusiasm for that work and the product. And that's, you know, 2 years of people across 12 or 14 different institutions working asynchronously. And it was, you know, it's still just sort of like a special moment, right? And the idea of having a maintainers group is also sort of exciting for me. I don't want to hog the mic. We got 3 minutes, but I will say that while we were doing our work, there was another team of the Born Digital Working Access group, Born Digital Access Working Group, that was working on understanding users' needs. And I think that maybe they consider their results a little bit preliminary. Like, it wasn't a very big survey that they did, but I think they've started to pull together some information that, along with a couple of other projects that have been done, that could maybe start to serve as that foundation of understanding. And then honestly, just like in the reading room, working with our researchers to understand, you know, what they're looking for, how they find it, how they're going to use it, what their pain points are, things like that.
And I just wanted to add on to that, something that I mentioned in the chat, which I am mentioning only because I sort of framed it as kind of a joke, but I was very serious about it. And that was, I think it's really important to recognize and talk about and elevate the profile of the maintenance that digital preservation requires, writ large, including the maintenance of resources like these that kind of underpin our practice, really, our field. And I think there aren't currently that many opportunities to really recognize this kind of work, and that is very important. So I do hope that the DPC will seriously consider ways that they can recognize and award this work. Maybe not necessarily a DPC award as such, but I do think it's important, and I think that might go a long way toward some of what you're talking about.
And William, I'll do the coda, which is, I think the best solution is what we're seeing here, and that is bringing in different viewpoints, different voices, whether it's organizational, individual perspectives. I think that's the best litmus for a healthy network and a healthy approach to what we're doing, and constantly reflecting on whether or not we're meeting those goals and reaching as many people as we could. So figuring out the mechanisms by which that can happen. I'll do my plug for thinking about some shared programming among the major digital preservation conferences and professional events, where we could foster that community of practice through those structures, PASIG, iPres, DigiPres, things like that, explicitly to say this is what we're working on. I think hearing from you all and bringing those voices back is what's going to keep the levels of all the kinds of levels useful and kind of reflecting what the needs of the community are. That's an ongoing effort that someone's got to pay attention to, and it's the community that will need to own it.
Great stuff. Thank you. Lots of thumbs up, lots of +1s for the DPC award for maintenance. And what did you, resource maintenance? Absolutely.
How did we end up with an action out of this call?
That's not what's supposed to happen.
You're welcome, William.
No, thank you. Honestly, that's been absolutely wonderful to hear from you all again. I'm just delighted to well, as I say, hear from you all, but to kind of hear your plans for the next year, to have a sneak preview on what's coming up, and to know that there's some great stuff to look forward to after this year particularly. So that's all for today's session. Thanks everybody as well for taking part. I can see some more comments in the box, so we'll just grab those, and if there are any other things to pass on to the speakers, we'll do that. We're going to publish this recorded episode at the end of the week with the others, and we'll share that with you all by email. And we're back again tomorrow at 3 o'clock GMT, when I'm going to be joined by Margaret Crockett and Vuzi Tibetse to talk about the Digital Records Curation Programme, and also Student Award winner Lottie Weisman. So thank you again, all of you, all of our speakers, for joining us today, all of you on the webinar, in our audience as well, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now.